Hi, so I'm Hal and welcome back to my channel, and I'm here just to have a little chat about all the books that I ended up reading last month in November. I ended up reading 8 books in November, so I just want to kind of go through them one by one and just discuss kind of my thoughts and feelings, what I thought about them. I had mostly had a good time with all of these there. So the first book that I ended up finishing in November was Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is an adult kind of fantasy book which is set up as kind of an historical account of the Targaryen kings and queens, kind of written around this time that the story is kind of taking place, or near enough to the start of kind of A Song of Ice and Fire, or the Game of Thrones books. I read the A Song of Ice and Fire books last year, kind of along with a friend. We were both reading the books kind of at the same time, so we kept on going to each other and just chatting about everything that was happening in these books. And I had a really good time with them. So then when the same Fred mentioned that he'd picked up Fire and Blood and he was telling me a bit about the kind of concept of it and how he was having a good time, I was like, I've got to pick that up. So I put in a hold at my library, and I kind of ended up reading it all in one go. So like I mentioned, it's an in fiction historical account, kind of in-world historical account, and this book takes us from the kind of Aegon the Conqueror all the way to the end of the regency of Aegon III, and it has the Dance of Dragons, which has been adapted into the House of the Dragon series. I had a really good time. Is it long? Absolutely. Is it dense? Yes. But one of my favourite things, especially when we get to certain points of the narrative, is that our kind of in-universe writer spends some time discussing he has various sources for what he's telling us about, and you can see how he feels about all of those various sources. You know, is this actually what happened? Is it exaggerated? Is our source even at the place where this thing is said to have happened? And I just felt that added so much kind of flavour to the text kind of thing. And the other thing as well is that there are just some I read the ebook version of this, absolutely gorgeous illustrations throughout this book that really kind of added to the vibe. It was definitely something I was reading at the end of the book. They had a little interview with George R.R. Martin, and he definitely wanted to have those illustrations in the book, and I definitely agree that they add a little something to it. It did take me a little while to actually get into this book, because like I mentioned, it's quite dense, but once I got into it, I had a really good time throughout this whole book. I ended up giving this actually 4 stars. I really enjoy it. I do enjoy kind of the Game of Thrones books, I will say as well. The next book that I was reading is Crypt by Professor Alice Roberts. This is a non-fiction book that discuss kind of archaeology, especially like the osteoarchaeology, so the study of bones, throughout history. And I think she's written various books, and these ones are specifically about kind of the medieval Middle Ages period up to about the 16th century as well, either looking at very specific individuals who have died or kind of groups of individuals that have died due to violence or disease. This was really interesting. I really love to listen to kind of non-fiction books kind of as audiobooks, kind of like a really long podcast, and Professor Alice Roberts is narrating this book, and she just has a really good way of explaining the information, breaking it down and making it seem approachable, even when she is discussing those more complicated kind of forensic, archaeological techniques and stuff like that. My one real gripe with this book is that it's very obviously pop kind of science book, and so some things are kind of discussed in that more surface level way, and one of the things that this happened to me too was kind of discussion of sex characteristics in skeletons. Obviously, you know, with humans there is a level of sexual dimorphism, but it's not to the extent that kind of you can always tell skeletons apart just based on their features. And also having read other books about forensic archaeology and kind of anthropology by Sue Black, who talks quite in depth about sexing of skeletons and how kind of trans individuals fits into that story. I just felt like this was a bit flat, but obviously, you know, I understand that this is not the point of the book as well. So this is just really personal gripe, but overall I had a really good time. I felt like the stories that she picked to talk about various techniques worked really well, and I just overall enjoyed it, and I did end up giving it 3 stars as well. The next book that I finished was The Brides of High Hill by Nghi. This is, you know, the latest book in the Sinking Hill cycle, which is a series of kind of interconnected, you know, fantasy novellas following Claire Nghi of the Sinking Hills. I think you can read them in any order. The main thing is that they, you know, feature Nghi and often their bird as well. And basically, with this abbey, all of these monks kind of go to various places and learn this kind of stories of people living there, and then tell their own stories as well. In this one, Nghi has been asked to join a bride and her bridal party as they go to her wedding for kind of this aging ruler of this kind of walled city, and things aren't quite right and they start to investigate what's going on. All of these novellas are quite short, so this one was just about 115 pages, so like things happen quite quickly. I always find that they're kind of really fun little stories, but they never quite stick with me. Especially, you just have kind of, it's more difficult to get all the emotions and everything through in that short amount of time, but I always have a fun time and I always pick up the next one when it comes into my library, and I end up giving this one 3 stars as well. The next book that I read, I do actually have a physical copy of because it was The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, and I got a physical copy of this out from the library. So this is the kind of Natasha Pulley book that I read in November. This one's kind of more of like speculative historical fiction. I wouldn't explicitly say that it's fantasy, but we're dealing with kind of alternate history and some other speculative things that are going on, which is a bit of a plot point, so I'm not going to spoil it kind of in here. We start off with our main character, Joe Tournier, who has basically got off this train from Edinburgh and has to London and has completely lost all of his memories. He cannot remember kind of anything apart from the name Madeline, and then when he goes back to kind of his old life, he does receive this postcard with a picture of the Island Moor lighthouse, which was apparently kept to him for 90 years, even though the lighthouse was only built recently, with the kind of saying on the back, "Come home if you remember M." And he's very much like, what's going on? What's explained this? And when we start off, we're also in this kind of alternate history where basically Napoleon won the Napoleonic Wars and Britain is now being held as a French colony. And so Joe is kind of has like a French master and stuff like that. Things absolutely get more complicated from there. As I mentioned, there is another aspect to this book that isn't just an alternate history, and things really kind of evolve from there. There's a lot of stuff. I thought that this was, you know, done really well. I really enjoyed that, you know, the other aspect of this. I thought that that was done really well, and it's definitely something that isn't always done really well. Obviously, at this point, I've read quite a few of Natasha Pulley's books. There's certain kind of things that I've picked up on that tend to happen across all of her books. And so again, there was definitely kind of, you know, even this time as well, there was a morally questionable love interest that turns up and stuff like that. I felt like for the time period that this is set in and kind of everything that's going on, the level of violence that was present in this book made sense and worked well for it. However, because a lot of it was a lot more on screen almost than some of the other books, it didn't work quite as well for me. I couldn't let some of that go in the same way that I could with, you know, a Chekhov Half-Life of Gallery K or Aubrey Gale, The Mars House. Even though, looking at it objectively, I would say that they're all on that same kind of line of very morally questionable actions kind of there. Overall, this absolutely slapped. I had such a good time. I was, you know, screaming, crying, throwing up at various sections in this book. I worked out one of the like main twists very early on because I was trying to explain this book to my friends, but I still had such a good time being like, oh my god, when are we going to figure this out kind of thing. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book that I was reading, and this is kind of a new series that I've decided to start, is His Majesty's Dragon, or Temeraire, by Naomi Novik. This is, I believe, an adult kind of fantasy novel, which hysterically for me, because I was reading this at the same time as an audiobook, as The Kingdoms, is also a book about the Napoleonic Wars with alternate history, but this time it's, what if there were dragons? What if the British stole a dragon egg that was meant for Napoleon, and then it hatched, and Captain William Lawrence now had a dragon that he had to look after, and became a dragon rider almost. So that's kind of the initial setup for this book, and now Lawrence, along with his dragon called Temeraire, have to kind of, he's growing because he's only just hatched, and they're learning how to become aviators kind of in this world, and how to fight kind of as part of Britain's kind of fighting dragon force. I had a really good time with this book. I do feel like Naomi Novik has hit the main things that you need to do with dragon books, which is, 1, Temeraire is just a little guy. All of the dragons in this are such little guys. They have so much personality. They have so much kind of quirks going on. 2, they care about each other so much. Very early in this book, Lawrence starts referring to Temeraire as my dear, and I'm obsessed with them. Deeply. And it's the cutest thing I've ever seen. But I feel that very much adds to it. The most important part of kind of this is, do they have a relationship, you know? And third, because it's set in this early time period, I think she's done a really good job at actually setting it in that time period. The people very much reflect the views that were present in that time period. Does that mean that Lawrence has some opinions that are questionable? Absolutely. But I think it works, and it's definitely a book where I'm reading it and it feels appropriate to kind of the time period that was going on. And I've ended up giving that book 3 stars as well. And as I mentioned, I am continuing this series as well. So I also managed to finish Throne of Jade in November as well. By this book, by the end of kind of the first book, start of the second book, we've learnt a lot more about Temeraire and kind of the type of dragon that he is, and that leads us to having to go to China to do some diplomacy about everything that's kind of gone on with his acquisition. I felt that there was some really good character development for both, and character struggles almost, for both Lawrence and for Temeraire. The only kind of downside is that those, questionable beliefs that Lawrence holds, especially, in this world of colonial Britain and those scarce interactions with the East. So, there's that going on. I would definitely keep that in mind. But overall, I had a fun time. I gave this one 3 stars again. Another book that I read this month that I also have a physical copy of is Echi in Tempesta, by Christelle Dabos, or Storm of Echoes in English. This is the 4th and final book of the Mirror Visitor series, or as I was reading it in Italian, La Traversa Specchi. This is a young adult kind of fantasy series. I first read this several years ago, and it's set in this world where the Earth is basically kind of broken apart and everyone are living on these floating kind of islands called arcs, where they have this kind of family spirit, and they're all descended from the spirit, and they all have different kind of powers depending on what spirit that they're related to. So our main character, Ophelia, comes from the anima arc, so in this one they can animate objects, they can read the history from objects and things like that, whereas our other main character, Thorn, is from the pole arc, and they all have powers that are related to kind of mental manipulation. So he has the power to kind of do these mental attacks with his kind of claws, they're called, but they feel very real when someone is attacking you with these things. The story starts when Ophelia, who has turned down various marriage proposals from people on her own arc, is put into this arranged marriage with Thorn on the pole arc, and she has to go to the pole to kind of marry him, and things kind of very much get more complicated from there. As I mentioned, I read this series for the first time several years ago, and when I was reading it for the first time, I believe I read the first book in English and then the second book kind of in Italian, because I was on holiday at that point and I could get out of the local library to where we go to in Italy, and then the last couple of books again in English. And it's just really stuck with me, and so this year I kind of decided to read it again, but to read the whole series in Italian. I felt the world building in this series is really, really good. It's so fun. The characters are really good. I really like Ophelia and Thorn specifically, and their relationship has really stuck in my brain kind of ever since I first read it. They start off at such kind of opposing points. They're both very, I would say, quite prickly and introverted. When I first picked up, the first time I saw this book, I was a little bit put off by the blurb because they were doing a lot of kind of comparisons. And one of the things that they did was they compared the love story to kind of Twilight, and I was like, that's not what I want to read. But having read it, I would much more compare the love story to like maybe a Pride and Prejudice. Ophelia isn't as spunky as Elizabeth Bennet, but there's definitely that kind of vibe to them. It's a very slow burn relationship. We're not really getting anything until we're at like the third book in this series. But the way I really enjoyed the way that grows, and as we start off with this very kind of tense, they're very unimpressed with each other, and by the end of the series they're so cute together. They respect each other's boundaries really well, which is kind of one thing that I just keep thinking about. And obviously seeing that it was originally written in French, I really wanted to reread in Italian because I knew that they were going to do something with the informal formal you, and they did, and I had such a great time. It was just, like, this is going to hit me very well, and it did. And I really love this book series. The plot goes absolutely bonkers in a very like His Dark Materials way, so if you know, you know. But I just have a really fun time with it. I really like it. I really like the ending. The ending's also definitely stuck with me all this time, and it was kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to reread it. The only thing I would say is obviously I was reading them in Italian. I do find that the prose was maybe at a level that's a bit more difficult for me. I am fluent in Italian. My parents are Italian, I just don't read every day in it, so that first book was a little bit more of a slog to get through, but once I got into that, the writing style for it, it flew by really quickly, and I had such a good time. And the last book that I read this month was this little collection of locked room mysteries, edited by Stuart Davies. So this is a cute little kind of tiny book that I actually got, one of my friends very nicely got for me to read kind of whilst I was recovering from surgery, except I obviously didn't read it then. I decided to pick it up now. So, like the title kind of suggests, it's a collection of locked room mysteries, mainly from the Victorian and Edwardian period, from various different authors, including kind of the greats like Edgar Allan Poe and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but also people that I'd never heard of before. And they're all just little short stories where something has happened in a locked room, and there's often, a detective or someone explaining kind of what went on and kind of the solution to that mystery. This was really fun to read. I definitely think because I'm reading them kind of all back to back, I at some point kind of clued in to how these stories written in that kind of time period are all kind of quite similar in their writing style. And so when I got to there's a story in there written by Stuart Davies, which is set in that time period, but just the writing style is just that very much bit different because it's much more modern feeling. So I think that shows off that you can, when you're reading kind of a collection like this, you just kind of tune in to kind of what makes them a little bit special as well. I'm not going to go through every single story that's all in here because that would be a lot of time, but overall, I thought that these were really fun, and it's just like, because they're quite short as well, but I feel like they do a good job of setting up the mystery and then actually giving you solution and not making you wait around for a huge amount of time for it. But yeah, overall I had a good time, and I ended up giving that 3 stars as well. I must have, it slipped my mind, I just realised, but I also ended up giving Echi and Tempesta 4 stars as well there. I think I've rambled on about that book series enough to make you realise that I really enjoyed it kind of there. So that's everything that I've read in November. Kind of things that I'm currently reading as well. I am currently reading the 3rd book in the Temeraire series, and I'm having a good time. I'm obviously planning to kind of continue that series as quickly as the library will give me copies of the audiobooks. And then looking into kind of December as well, I believe that the next book I'm probably going to pick up is the Bedlam Stacks, which is going to be kind of my December Natasha Pulley book, kind of in that regard as well. And then I'm continuing to read The Valley of Fear with the Letters from Watson as well. But that's kind of everything that I've been reading kind of this month, and I hope that you've been reading some fun books as well.